is Maurice Barboza, and I'm the nephew of Lena Santos Ferguson, who in 1980 attempted to join the Daughters of the American Revolution. I believe it was 1978. I had the image of this photograph of my great-great-grandfather dressed in a Civil War uniform. It was a photograph of him that hung on my grandparents' living room wall. And I was always curious about it. I didn't really ask any questions. I only knew his last name. So one day I decided I'm going to call the archives and find out what I need to do to find his Civil War records. All I knew is that he had died. I began looking at the documents, and I saw that his name was John Curtis Gay, and that he was born in Maine, lived in Union, Maine, that he enlisted in the Civil War in 1864 of January, was able to put together two generations that seemed that they might not be the family of Jonah Gay, who had a son named Jonah Gay. The younger one was a soldier at the age of 15 in the Revolution. And probably about a week later, she received a reply, and she called me, and she read it to me on the phone. But she also said, I don't think they want me because they're just reading to me what the bylaws say about you need to have two sponsors. And it was sort of a standoffish letter. And so she knew immediately what she was up against. And so eventually she did find a chapter to approach, and she found a sponsor, and they wouldn't allow her to submit papers because they wouldn't give her the papers. And so that's the story in March of 1984 that a friend of mine who was now at the Lawyers Committee saw and called me and said, we'd like to become involved. And Rod Boggs arranged for Hogan and Hartson at that time, now Hogan Lovells, to represent my aunt. And Joseph Hassett and Patricia Brannon, who was a young attorney at the time, took on the case and began to negotiate with the Daughters of the American Revolution. It wasn't long afterward that we began to realize that the DAR was not abiding fully by the terms of the contract. And even today, so many years later, they are not keeping track of African American applicants. I sent an email to Jonathan Smith, and this was, I believe, May or so of 2021, and immediately I received a response back. We spoke on the phone. I explained it to him, and he thought this was an important thing. And then a few days later, he told me that he had spoken to Pat Brannon, and she wanted to resume her representation.
In 2022, the Daughters of the American Revolution announced that they would post a tribute to Ms. Ferguson on their webpage, place a plaque to her in their garden, double the scholarship fund in her honor, and hold a wreath-laying ceremony at Arlington Cemetery.
She never once said, Maurice, this is too much, and I'm gonna be retiring soon, and I'm gonna just try to enjoy myself, and I think I've had enough. Never was that ever spoken. She felt that her ancestry was just as significant as the next Americans, but she also believed what a lot of other people could not even conceive of, that there could be hundreds or thousands of other African American women with most stories far more interesting and fascinating than our family story, who might be willing to join this organization if it behaved in a certain way that was inviting to them. The involvement of the Lawyers Committee and Pat and the others really has given me a new life a new sense that all this was not for naught, that we achieved something that's going to be important and permanent. So it's liberated me. I feel great about it, and I know that Lena would feel the same way, and I'm just sad that it's taken so long and that she couldn't have seen this herself.
We are pleased to recognize Pat Brannon and Hogan Lovells today for decades of dedication to Lena Ferguson and her family. Black Lives Matter demonstrators
Okay, it's all you, Maurice.
Okay.
Yes. Welcome. All your friends are in the audience from your neighborhood.
Well, that's wonderful. So pleased.
It always works in
Oh.
practice.
I think the adjustment here, it was hidden. Okay, we're getting closer.
Santos.
Are you able to see the slides now?
Yep.
Okay, terrific. Well, I'm Maurice Barboza, and I'm overjoyed to join you this evening and to be in Plainville, if only virtually. And I want to thank the Queen Nzinga Center, Valerie Gale Williams, Dana Snell, and the Plainville Historical Society, Rosemary Morani, for all the wonderful publicity that she generated for this, and all the volunteers I've heard about and guests tonight, and to the museum founders who have a wonderful legacy. I enjoyed growing up in Plainville. I especially loved riding my bicycle, and before that, my tricycle downtown. I could go walk on the Central Square on my tricycle. As I grew older and my mother gave me that responsibility, I remember going to the Strand Luncheon in particular. And all the neighbors were great. We had a wonderful neighborhood. We had great teachers, so we were really given a gift. And I'm glad to be here to talk to you about this project. What's it about? It's about an ancestor speaking through a picture, the source of my sense of curiosity, a discovery of heritage, my acceptance, Lena's rejection, an affront to American principles, rescuing heroes from obscurity, and a monument to unity. This is my aunt, Lena Santos Ferguson. She was a member of the class of 1947, and you could see her just below the arrow. This is a excerpt from a letter that was sent to the DAR, and it says, it would be an act of genuine kindness and reconciliation for the DAR to put up a plaque memorializing Mrs. Ferguson's contribution in a place of public prominence at the DAR National Headquarters. And that letter came in 2022, and this was 20 years after Lena's death. And remarkable changes had occurred within the DAR, which they decided they were going to take credit for. They weren't going to give any to my aunt. They weren't going to concede that they were forced to do things that they didn't want to do. This is the plaque, which was established. It's just around the corner, or rather next door to Constitution Hall. And it's very close to the main entrance that most people use to visit the library and other parts of the wonderful facility there. And this is the house where my aunts and uncles grew up. My grandparents raised them. My grandfather had gardens in the back and side of the yard, and also across the street, which is land owned, which is now land of, of Norton Park. So this Norton Park was a big part of our lives, as it is for everyone from Plainville. And this is a picture that was taken in about 1946. Lena is the second one in from the left. My mother is on the far right in the back row. And the little girl to the right, my grandmother's right, is Patricia Santos Gray, who is the only one still living. The two people who were missing are my great-grandfather's namesake, Alfonso Santos, and the oldest child, Margaret Santos Barboza, who had moved to Massachusetts, and I guess they couldn't get everyone together at the same time. These are my great-grandparents, Alfonso Gay and Rosa King Gay. Alfonso was from Maine, and Rosa was born in Bermuda Hundred, which is about 8 miles south of Richmond, and very close to a battle where this man was wounded on June 1st of 1864 at the very bloody battle of Cold Harbor. He was an ever-present fixture in the home on South Washington Street. And I'm going to go back to this slide, and here you can see the arrow pointing to his pictures. He was even there in that picture taken in 1946. So it was passed along, I believe it was probably passed along initially by my great-grandmother, and perhaps it was Alfonso who had the picture made from a tintype. And in my travels to uncover their whereabouts in those days, I used the U.S. Archives town halls in Massachusetts, Maine, state archives, the Library of Congress, museums, bookstores, seaport museums, tape recorded interviews, and I actually visited the battlefield at Cold Harbor. And this is the U.S. Archives, where I found the records of John Curtis Gay. I had no clue how to start genealogical research. I just decided that it's something I have wanted to do for a long time, to determine who this man was. And so one day I called the archives in 1978 during the summer, and they explained to me what I needed to do. So on a Saturday morning, I arrived. I passed the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, went in through some glass doors, went to the main desk, and they said, I told them I only knew that the man's last name was Gay, and I did not know his first name. They said, well, we can give you 3 folders at a time, sit at a desk. So shortly thereafter, they delivered 3 folders. I looked through the first one. I saw nothing that seemed to connect with my family. Then I opened the second one. It was about maybe close to an inch thick. It was full of documents that were filed upon his death. His enlistment paper was in there. And so I was excited because I thought, wow, there are actually addresses of people, places where they lived, and perhaps I should take a trip to Maine and actually visit these places. And these are some of the places that I visited. In the top left is the Union, Maine Town Hall. I called and they said, sure, come on in, we've got records. And so when I arrived that day, I could see that there was an enormous safe in the center of the room. the door was open and there were, just hundreds of huge bound books with the history of the town recorded over 200 or 300 years. And to the right, the Dedham Historical Society in Massachusetts, where I had a wonderful welcome. The main archives, where I discovered that I might have ancestors who served in the Revolutionary War. They, when I was doing my research in Union, I got back far enough to think, well, it's a possibility. So I changed my plans. I went there and I found information. Richmond Archives was a disappointment. I couldn't find basic things like where the Black cemeteries were. And in Prince William County, close to where I lived, I found the book, The Negro in the American Revolution. And it was by Dr. Benjamin Quarles, and he explains that the estimate of historians was there may have been 5,000 Blacks who served. I thought by that point that there probably were just, maybe 24, whatever. But it opened a new avenue to approach this, which I didn't know I would need. And this was a kind note written to me on a book by this, at the time, a young historian, Robert Hanson. I walked into I'm telling you this because my welcome was so wonderful and overwhelming. Everyone wanted to help. And I walked into the Dedham Museum, and my ancestors left Dedham in 1750. They'd been there since 1635. And the person who received me or saw me coming in through the door kept asking me, well, what are you looking for? And I didn't want to tell her. And then when I did, her eyes lit up and she said, well, I think that our young historian, Robert Hanson, in his book has included information about the history of the gay family here. And if you could come back at about 3 o'clock, I'll have him come by and greet you. And so he wrote me this little note for Maurice Barboza upon a family return to Dedham. And this is the Daughters of the American Revolution Library. It's an extraordinary resource, an extraordinary place. And all of my travels would have been compressed into approximately 1 hour had I gone there first rather than to the archives. Because I found the surname Gay in their card catalog and a volume, the Gay Cushman genealogies of very allied families. I went to the shelf, pulled it out, and it had a whole genealogy from the arrival of John Gay in 1630 on the Mary and John ship. And it went all the way up to my great grandfather, Alfonso, and his birth in 1850. So everything was there. So the questions that I had about the connections between the post-Civil War and the pre-Revolutionary War period were answered, and the genealogy was linked together from myself to, all the way back. This is the Library of Congress, and I love this part of the library, but I'm more affectionate for the stacks where the books are situated, and there are wrought iron stairways and walkways and all this. And I had a friend who was a historian there, and she would let me know anytime that she went into the records and discovered a Black soldier who had served in the Revolutionary War. This is a record from Union, Maine. It's the birth of John Curtis Gay in 1827. We are. These are some of the records that I discovered, that the voluntary enlistment in Bangor, Maine, and then an internment page that listed he died of gangrenous wounds in the thigh on December 26, 1864. This is a letter from the Army hospital telling his family that they were returning his or forwarding his pay, his clothing account, and inventory and effects. This is a claim for minor's pension, and it lists his children and Martha Stinson, whom he married in July of 1850, and it lists my great-grandfather, Alfonso Gay, his sister, Mary Ida Gay, and Dora Gay. And I have a picture of Alfonso with his two sisters in New York. They came to visit him after he was married to Rosa King on a few occasions. And my grandmother also visited Martha Stinson, her grandmother, at least once when she was a child. And this is an interesting record. It shows the hospitals where he was placed, including initially he was sent to, after his wound, he was sent to New York. He contracted gangrene, as I mentioned earlier, but the DeCamp U.S. General Hospital, which is actually in around New Rochelle at the top of Manhattan. And then he was sent to Augusta, where he died. And I was delighted to find this record. This was something I found on the internet, and it shows John Curtis Gay, that he died at the Coney Hospital. But it also shows another man, but it shows how interconnected these generations and families were, named James Maxey. And the Maxey family actually left Massachusetts around in 1750s with the Gay family and probably other families, and set out to Maine, which was a part of Massachusetts still at that time. Joseph Maxey, I believe, was probably an ancestor of this man, and he sold them their house in Union, which you'll see shortly. And this is a record of burial at Oak Hill Cemetery in Winter, Maine. Pat Brannon and her two grandchildren visited because they live nearby in the summer. This is a scene from the battlefield at Cold Harbor. This is a scene of devastation. This is John Curtis Gay's stone, and it states that he was in Company A, 7th Regiment, Maine Volunteers, and he was 38 years old. And this was a restaurant, a lovely little restaurant. It was very sunny. And the first day of my trip, I passed by and thought I'd have breakfast there. And I walked in, I saw a stack of books, and sat down and asked the server, well, what are those? She said, oh, they're bicentennial books for the town. They were done in 1976. So as I was waiting for my food, I went up to the cashier and I thumbed through the books, and voila, I find this house, which is a house sold to in 1798 by Joseph Maxey to Jonah Gay. And Jonah Gay was a Revolutionary War soldier, the son of the older Jonah Gay, who was a member of the Committee of Correspondence of Friendship, Maine. The back part of the house, you see what looks like a barn maybe, and then there's a white building. Those were built by the Maxey family, and the Gay family built the main house that you see on Route 17. And this is the house today, and our Pat Brannon photographed it on her visit, and they welcomed her and her husband and two grandchildren, and they went through the house where my ancestors lived and toured the grounds, and I just felt so connected, particularly to those two children who were playing and all on a land that had been owned by played on by John Curtis Gay when he was a child. This is where it's situated on Route 17, the Gay House. I'm going to see if I can find that little laser thing, because I think I'm pointing, but actually you can't see I don't believe that you can see the cursor. Oh, well.
It's me. Where do you want me to go?
Oh, no, it's, I just need to find the selection for the cursor. Oh, here it is. For the laser pointer. Here we go. Okay, so can you see the picture?
Look at it.
Oh, you can.
Yes.
Okay, great. So that's the home, and these are lakes that are behind it, and this one is the closest, Crawford Pond in Union, Maine. And so this is the genealogy from the arrival of John Gay from England in 1630. And there's a connection to Plainville, remote by 9 generations or whatever, but Calvin Coolidge arrived in that same flotilla that John Gay arrived in on the Mary and John, and Calvin Coolidge's ancestors, and his ancestor's name was John, and there were many Johns between. Well, Calvin Coolidge was John Calvin Coolidge, who married Florence Trumbull in Plainville in 1929 on Farmington Avenue, and the marriage took place at the church right around the corner from you, the Congregational Church on West Main Street. This is the genealogy I referred to earlier, the Gay Cushman genealogy with all the names and what I needed to make my genealogy bulletproof. So the DAR never questioned the genealogy, although they tried to imply that there might be something awry, but they always said it was bulletproof. And this is my genealogy submitted to the Sons of the American Revolution I believe it was, well, it took 2.5 months. So two and a half months before April 16th, that's when I submitted the paper. I mean, it was really rapid. I submitted the papers, and I'm going to tell you how this occurred, because you can compare it to my aunt Lena's experience with the DAR. So I met an extraordinary man, Charles Blockson, who collected over 50,000 books on African Americans, their history, our history. And he wrote a book, Black Genealogy. So he was an expert on genealogy and African American history. He donated those books in 1984. I believe that was 4 years after I met him. And it's grown to 500,000 volumes. And this contribution he made was all the result of a school teacher. He's in a history class. The teacher's talking about American history. And he goes up and he says, well, why don't you talk about Blacks? And she said, well, they never did anything. They never did anything. And he spent his life proving her so wrong. This is my certificate of membership. Oh, that's coming up. But this is the genealogy. This only contains the ancestors who served in the Revolutionary. Jonah Gay as a committee of correspondence in what was then called Meduncook. It's Friendship, Maine now. And he was a patriot because he participated in the civil portions of supporting the revolution. Jonah Gay was his 15-year-old son who enlisted. Elijah Gay was the father of John Curtis Gay, and he died young, as did Jonah Gay. All the generations, these 3 generations, died before the age of 39. Jonah, the son, 15, at about 38 or so, was killed in an accident when a barn that he was helping to construct, a beam fell on him and killed him instantly. And then Elijah Gay, and then Martha Stinson, John Gay. Martha's the namesake of my mother. Rosa King, Alfonso, Ida Gay, my grandmother, and my grandfather Ovidio from Cape Verde Islands. Oh, okay. I didn't advance the slide, so you didn't actually see what I was describing. And this information, the certificate of membership, and this is Mr. Blockson's book, and this is an inscription that he gave me. And this is Bermuda 100, where my grandmother was born, and I believe she left at about 7 or 8 years old. It was a port, and it was a main port until during the 1700s. And it became, and it remained a port because the ships couldn't get into Richmond because the James River wasn't deep enough. And so that was cured. And now the community's fallen into a slumber. It was established by Sir Thomas Dale in 1613. And there were, as I said, a customs house. And there's another remote connection to Plainville here, and that is General Benjamin Butler during the Civil War had his base of operations there. And there's a house on the corner of Crown Street and Maple. I believe it's 37 Maple Street. When I was a child, it was lived in by Miss Smith and Miss Pettibone, who were teachers. And the owner in the 1880s was, I believe his first name was Frank Butler, and he was the nephew of Benjamin Butler. Benjamin Butler had a half-brother, and the half-brother is the father of that former resident of Plainville. This is the census for 1880, which here shows my great-grandmother, the 1880 census for Bermuda 100. Her father, Thomas King, and Booker King. This is the approximate location of where their house was located. And this is what Bermuda 100 looks like now. And this is what it looked like, back in 1890, when my great-grandfather probably saw it for the first time. He was a coasting sea captain, and they delivered cargoes from Maine to Virginia, and the cargoes included coal and ice and whatever else, and people would invest their money in shares of the ships. And this particular ship was built in Saco, Maine in 1840. It's called the Laconia. And it was 65 feet long. It was a schooner, I believe a two-masted schooner. And there's a description on this paper, and it lists Alfonso Gay as the present master, shows the investors, the owner's stake in the ship. And this is now an introduction to where Alfonso, Rosa, and the child Ida Gay, my grandmother, moved, and they took up residence on a tugboat in New York Harbor. My mother told me that my grandmother never attended school, that her father, Alfonso, taught her to read and write. And she didn't talk a lot. She wasn't, I didn't talk a lot either at the time. Now, completely changed, as you can see. And so I didn't ask her questions and that sort of thing. So I got these inclinations from my mother. This is what might be something that their home would have looked like. So this is where Alfonso Gay left the coasting industry and settled down in New York with his daughter and his wife. And they took in 2 children. My mother said they were poor children. Their family didn't have enough to feed them. And they were my Aunt Nellie. I'd never met Nellie, but she was so close to my grandmother. I don't think sisters could be that close. They visited every year. Lena went to New York and stayed with them, and as did the other daughters, and I guess the sons did as well. And there was also George Myers, Nellie's brother, and Uncle George came to Plainville every year, spent 2 weeks at my grandparents' house. He built things and he came to visit us every day, really. And we went and visited there, and he was just a lovely man. And actually, I called the past owner of the Cleary brothers. This was probably about 1979. And Mr. Cleary was one of the brothers who owned this company. He remembered George Myers, and he described him, and I knew that was the person that he was remembering. And actually, a cousin of mine has been in touch with, I guess, the granddaughter or great granddaughter of Aunt Nellie, and her name is Gay. Her first name is Gay. And this is just a scene of showing South Street Seaport in New York City. And here we have the DIR's attitudes and their treatment of Lena wasn't something new. They didn't just say, oh, you know, we want to keep this lady out. Over 100 years after this organization was founded, and right up until, you know, probably the 2000s, they were behaving in a manner that suggested that they wanted to maintain their stance of white nationalism. And this was a famous event. Marian Anderson on the right from Danbury, who lived in Danbury, Connecticut. Howard Ickes, who was the Secretary of the Interior when the Daughters of the American Revolution exercised their clause in their contracts not to allow Blacks to perform. They allowed them to be in the audience up in the back corner somewhere, but they couldn't perform. So many, you know, outstanding artists couldn't perform at the largest venue in Washington. They couldn't perform at the National Theater either, which wasn't quite as big. But this is the concert that, excuse me, Mr. Ickes arranged for Marian Anderson. 77,000 people outstretched to the Washington Monument. Lena heard this concert on the radio with her father and my grandmother and I guess other family members. And her husband, James Ferguson, was actually there. His father took him everywhere. Any event in Washington, they were there. They went to the museums. And as a result, this guy was very knowledgeable about Washington and about just the way things were. And Lena said at 9 years old that she told her mother, Ida, that I bet we could join the DAR. She knew that she had a white grandfather, and she knew the DAR only accepted white people. So sure, there might have been that possibility. But I'm sure it never occurred to her that, well, maybe her Black grandmother had ancestors who also served in the Revolutionary War. And this is very similar. This is, 2 decades later. This is the March on Washington in 1963. And it's pretty much a photograph taken from the same vantage point. You see all these people lined along the mall and the reflecting pool. And Dr. King, as we all know, said he had a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. And that dream he was referring to was the dream of freedom and liberty. And without these people that we're talking about, these Revolutionary War era, there wouldn't have been a civil rights movement, because they built the infrastructure, the churches, the self-help groups. They were abolitionists. They protested taxation. They set the example, and they became the infrastructure. So in 1980, I invited my aunts to my house on a Saturday morning. It was May 3rd, 1980. And I showed them the documents that I'm showing you tonight. And I said to them and Lena, Eve, her younger sister, and Patricia, she I said, why don't you join the DAR? This was in May after I had received my certificate. And Lena said, I'll try, Maurice, but it won't be easy. And I said, but this is 1980, I replied. And she knew when she came to Washington in 1952 to interview for a job at the Navy Department, which coincidentally was very close to the location you just saw, the reflecting pool. There were a bunch of dozens of Navy buildings built for World War I and then used in World War II. And Nixon wiped them out when he saw it from the air. He said, what a mess that is. And they built a beautiful park there called Constitution Gardens. So Lena was actually working on the site where that we had won for the memorial and a previous iteration of this previous iteration of the memorial. So the other aunts weren't biting. They knew because they lived, at least Eve and Patricia lived through a segregated Washington. They had to go to they couldn't go to all the restaurants, National Theater and everything else. It was pretty much they went from an integrated, Plainville to a segregated Washington so that they could be part of a community that they didn't have in Plainville. And this is the letter Lena wrote. She did it immediately. We saw each other on May 3rd, May 6th. On Monday, she wrote to Mrs. Niebel, who she was told is the regent. And she says, I'd like some information how to join. And my nephew is a member of the Sons. And by being a member of the Sons, she knew immediately that Lena was qualified by virtue of her genealogy and heritage to the Revolutionary War. Notice her address up in the upper right-hand corner. Then on May 19th, Mrs. Niebel responded and said, I thought it best to send you the above rather than explain over the telephone. Well, the above constitutes the bylaws. She doesn't even say, well, gee, it's so nice to know that you're interested in, like my experience. Let me give you the names of 2 daughters in your area. Go visit them, talk to them, get their signatures on your application paper as well. There was no offer of any help whatsoever. Lena saw it immediately and she called me right after she received it and said, they don't want me. They saw my address in Southeast Washington, and Southeast Washington is a known Black community across the Anacostia River where few people other than Blacks travel. It's a lovely community. Lena lived in a lovely little house on a hill, but the place emptied out of her fellow Americans when Blacks began to buy there. So they were prepared, Lena was prepared for the welcome that she received or non-welcome that she received from the DAR. And here this just says that what I just repeated. And if we go back to 1947, the President General then, Talmadge, was asked, this was just after Hazel Scott, the wife of the very influential and brilliant congressperson, attempted to perform to make arrangements to perform there. The DAR refused. And she was asked, well, what would you do if a Black person applied for membership in your organization? And she explained in terms very similar to what I just told you was contained in the letter to Lena. Well, you gotta have, but we'd take them certainly, but they gotta have an authentic lineage, which meant that you had to prove not that they were descended from a Revolutionary War patriot, but that all the marriages were, there was a priest or a minister or a rabbi who married you, etc. And you had to pass the desirability test. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure I could pass the desirability test if the SAR had applied it to me. And you need two sponsors. So right there, if you're Black or Asian or Hispanic, you're not going to pass the desirability test or get those sponsors. And this is an article after, in about 1983, a reporter, a very good reporter, she was a society reporter, always wrote wonderful articles on the style section, which wasn't a page that I usually read. But I called her and asked her if she would take a look at Lena's dilemma. And so she agreed to do an article. She went to Lena's house and interviewed her. And, just looking at the article, you say, oh, that's great, and she brings out all the facts. But she says something that this was one small battle of a woman who became upset by her treatment. Well, it wasn't a small battle. The DAR was in existence for 100 years. The wives of presidents were heads of the organizations. Senators, congressmen, wealthy people were members of the DAR or attended events at Constitution Hall or were lauded for all of this. So it illustrates, I think, how even someone as intelligent and as well-read as she was, she didn't realize what the real meaning of this. I mean, desirability is something you'd use maybe to not allow a person to purchase a home or receive a loan. So this is all fundamentally underlying all of these problems and issues. And the DAR went one step further and they branded it patriotism, God and country. This is what God wants. This is what patriotism calls for. The exclusion of a whole large portion of the American public. So this was on the front page. And after that, there was a firestorm. I was getting calls right and left all morning long and for days and weeks. Every major publication covered this. Today's Show, 60 Minutes came to Lena's house. And this is what Sarah King, the President General at the time, had to say. She said, being Black is not the only reason why some people have not been accepted into chapters. King continued, there are other reasons: divorce, spite, neighbors' dislike. I would say being Black is very far down the line. There are a lot of people who are troublemakers. You wouldn't want them in there because they could cause some problems. We want them Blacks, but I do think lines should have integrity and legitimate dissent. I don't think you can have it any other way. That was from Ron Kessler's remarkable story in the Post in March of 1984. And after that morning, I also got a call from someone I had known previously. She was now at the Lawyers Committee, and she said, well, we saw the article and we'd like to represent your aunt and try to see whether we can help or not. And that was the Lawyers Committee arranged for Hogan and Hartson and Joe Hassett and Patricia Brannon to represent Lena. There was no lawsuit. We decided that we would try to get concessions that would end discrimination. And if the DAR was willing to negotiate, then Lena wouldn't sue them. Lena says in her encounters with this chapter in Washington, and there were, I don't know, 30 chapters, and she said that she went there and the reception was cool, and her sponsor would introduce her and they would say hello and turn their backs. And I got that same from ladies that I ran into and asked them if they could help out. And this is the story gone viral. These are just a few of the headlines, but on the left, you can see there are a short list of some of the organizations. And here's the proof. This is a story, book rather, a very lengthy book by Simon Wen, a German historian. And he examined the DAR and their influence on America and the Daughters of the American Revolution, patriotic memory in the 20th century. And he says, before Lena Ferguson's activism, the DAR had shown no intention of acknowledging Black citizens' role in U.S. nation building. And even though Lena had achieved all these things and they began to buy into it, they tried to take credit for her settlement agreement and what it brought them in terms of publicity, and good publicity, actually, for the first time. And as I mentioned earlier, I think Claire Booth Luce was one of the people. She was a congresswoman from Connecticut. She represented Putnam and that area. And she tried in vain for at least 2 or 3 years to change the DAR's behavior, and President General Talmadge derided the Committee Against Racial Discrimination as unconstitutional. So, you know, a lot of people thought that it was constitutional, informed the press that the Resolutions Committee would not consider the opposed resolution it had received from Luce's committee. So that pretty much went, so all these people who tried to reform the DAR failed. Dana, how are we running with the time? Because it seems I forgot to turn on my timer.
It sounds like you forgot to turn on your timer.
Yes.
This is riveting, but
Yes. Would you like me just to summarize the rest of it?
yeah, because
Or-
we also want, I would love for you to bring it on in, and also take
Okay.
a little bit of time to talk, to lay the groundwork about the work that you're moving forward, and then we'll allow our audience to ask some questions. So maybe like
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I think I actually covered most of it. I've digressed a little bit into what would come next.
but nobody was looking at me funny, so I guess it was all right. Can you hear us, Maurice?
Yes, I can.
Oh.
I'm all yours.
So, so I think so. So do we have any Maurice, why don't you talk about why don't you bring this to close and talk a little bit about the monument?
Sure. During this period of time that I was trying to do what I could to help Lena, I went to Congresswoman Nancy Johnson, who represented your area in 1983, and asked her if she'd introduce a resolution honoring African Americans who served. She did. It passed Congress. Reagan signed it. Just a few days, I believe, after that article appeared on the front page of the Washington Post, and it just honored African Americans, recognized their contributions to America. And from that, later on that year, I decided we had to build a monument. And that part of the project went very, very well, and then it kind of imploded. And now, in 2013, Congress approved legislation to establish a national liberty memorial to honor the 5,000, well, thousands of African Americans who contributed to the Revolutionary War, about 6,000 known soldiers, and maybe up to 20,000 actually, if they're researched completely. And the memorial would be, we're hoping that the memorial will be placed on the National Mall. This is just a model that was done by a wonderful sculptor, very elegant, but it only to show the elements that would be required: a man, a woman, a child. This is where we want to build it, on the mall, along this route, past the Pentagon and past the former Jefferson Davis Highway into Washington. And this piece of land, after you pass the Holocaust Museum, this piece of land sort of juts out into the main road. It's part of the USDA Agriculture Department. They were planning to build a park there, or rather a garden, an agricultural garden, and they opposed our having that site, but they were persuaded that this would be a good thing for them, and they came on board and became very active supporters. And this route goes all the way into downtown Washington. You can see the district building, and it continues on. So it's a fantastic site. It's directly across from the Washington Monument. This is the view to the Washington Monument from the site. And this is showing how significant and important our criteria was to have a site with a view to the Washington Monument, here the King Memorial and the African American History Museum. And the memorial location, as you can see down here, the Washington Monument, and these are all the museums along the mall, including the American History Museum. And this is the site in the 1930s, what it looked like. And this is the route to U Street, which was a haven for African Americans. I'm sure Lena and her sisters and family members visited this area particularly during segregation, when it was the only place you could go for entertainment. And it would have been in that green book as well. This is, okay, I guess I'm ready for your questions. Thank you.